So if John could come down and go ahead, and we'll start with the micro of the Salish Sea and then move on to the macro of the North Pacific instead of the other way around. So John is loaded up on the laptop, and hopefully we'll be able to deliver that shortly.
Okay. And I just want to say we've worked with John and Cascadia Research for many years with our sighting network, and just appreciate all the good work he has done. And he's used a lot of our sightings that we get from you guys, so we appreciate that. And you're seeing a lot of the uses that it's being put to, and that it's more than just getting to see the whales, which are in front of our house right now. But it really provides valuable data, and we just really appreciate him being here today.
Excuse me.
Oh, it was, but now it's gone. Interesting.
Let's see if we go there. Let's see, it should be under recent files, maybe.
Okay. Good. We almost had a second failure there. So part of the intended design was actually going to be, Fred was going to talk a little more broadly on humpback whales, as well as his work up in Alaska, and I was going to talk a little more about some of the local developments we've had with humpback whales. So I'll give a little bit of a background intro, and hopefully we won't duplicate too much. It's been an exciting change that's occurred inside the Salish Sea and Puget Sound, and when I first started my research in the mid-'70s with harbor seals, the Puget Sound itself was actually an area where we didn't have a lot of variety of marine mammals, and that has changed in a very exciting way over the last decade. We've seen a lot more different species. We've seen the return of harbor porpoise to Puget Sound in large numbers. We've documented now these regular gray whales that feed in northern Puget Sound and come back every year. And now in the last really 2 or 3 years, we've seen this exciting development with humpback whales, and that's some of what I want to feature. I'll draw just a tiny bit on SPLASH, a study we did in the mid-2000s that was the largest collaborative study on humpback whales, and it sort of sets the context for what's going on in Washington State. And this was a study that involved some 400 researchers across the whole North Pacific to document movements, population structure, and human impacts on humpback whales across the whole North Pacific. And it involved work from, the northern Philippines and outrigger canoes that you see in the lower right-hand corner there, to larger boat surveys, to small boat surveys. And part of what it showed, and I'll just show you a couple of figures from SPLASH, because again, it will show some of the complexity of humpback whale use of the North Pacific. You really see these lines connect known resightings of the same individual humpback whale between breeding and feeding areas. So part of what you need to understand about humpback whales is they make these seasonal migrations from low latitude breeding grounds, which primarily consists of some of the islands south of Japan, Ogasawara, Okinawa, all the way down to the northern Philippines, the Hawaiian Islands, and then several areas of Mexico, mostly mainland Mexico, and then an offshore set of islands called the Resightings. And then we had also, along with my wife Gretchen Steiger, who I think might be here, might be back, documented some of the heavy use of humpback whales of Central America, many of them going to the U.S. West Coast to feed. So that's what you see in this figure. These different colors actually represent humpbacks coming from different breeding grounds. And you can see the wide variety of locations those animals migrated to in terms of feeding grounds. So it ended up showing a much kind of richer picture of humpback whale movements rather than the more simplistic view we had before that, which was that Hawaii humpback whales go to southeast Alaska, Mexico whales go to U.S. West Coast, western North Pacific humpback whales off Ogasawara and Okinawa all go to Russia. Instead, they spread out and disperse pretty widely. So now this is taking different areas. Each bar is a different feeding area, and the area we're interested in, I'll see if I can get our cursor over there here. Here we are, northern Washington, B.C. All these different color bars show different breeding areas that the humpback whales that we had off Washington, British Columbia, had come from. And it just showed they were actually a pretty rich mix of animals coming from different breeding areas. And I'll get into that in a second a little bit more. Meanwhile, I'll just keep an eye out. How is Fred's preparations going? Is he?
Well, as soon as you're done, we'll make it work.
You will, okay, good. I'm going to show you just a little bit about genetics about humpback whales and then get right into our local sightings. And part of what I wanted to show you was just that along with some of these differences in humpback whale movements, the genetics ended up revealing that while humpbacks disperse between these breeding and feeding areas, they remain loyal enough to individual feeding areas and individual breeding areas that you can actually see these pretty dramatic differences in what are called mitochondrial DNA haplotypes. And this is actually laid out geographically. California in the lower right-hand corner, going up to southeast Alaska, and then across the North Pacific, and Russia at the very top left. And those pie charts are showing the mix of different mitochondrial DNA haplotypes that the animals sampled in those areas had. And the main point is you'll see how different those colors are. And it shows that there was, even though you saw this broad appearance of intermixture among humpback whales, there was enough loyalty to these areas that you actually have these genetic differences that are apparent in these different regions. Okay. And I think I'm going to now move and talk specifically about humpback whales in our region. Just last year, we published a paper on biologically important feeding areas for humpback whales. And I don't know if this map's going to be big enough. We identified different areas along the U.S. West Coast that were key feeding areas. And one of the ones I wanted to highlight is this one in this inset right here. This is Washington State. And this whole area highlighted right here, these are all sightings of humpback whales. And so we identified this area off the northern Washington coast as one of these now recognized by NOAA designated biologically important feeding areas for humpback whales. Now, what you'll see missing from that, which is really what this is leading into, is only a small smattering of sightings that occur in the inside waters of the Salish Sea. So you see all of these dots out here and this recognized area out here and very little in here. And that's partly because this was designated based on data going through about 2012, 2013. And at that time we were getting occasional sightings of humpback whales and a few animals in the Salish Sea, but nothing like what we've seen the last couple of years. So, for one thing, as I show you this West Coast map, I'm going to make one other distinction. This is showing the U.S. West Coast from California on up here to northern Washington. One distinction we made from the splash genetics and photo ID data is that the humpbacks that feed off California and Oregon represent a somewhat distinct feeding area. Most of those animals go to mainland Mexico and Central America. Almost none of them go to Hawaii. And that changes when you get up here to Washington State. And Washington State, you start to get into humpback whales that we generally don't see interchange with California and have a different mix of breeding areas that I'll show you what we're finding out about. And just to kind of make that point about this area, and I know I'm going to kind of show you something that maybe is a little bit tricky to look at here, but this is, for example, taking those genetic patterns and it's laying them spatially along the U.S. West Coast, coming up here from California down here all the way up to Washington and on up to British Columbia. And the main thing this graph is showing you, it's the proportions of some of those mitochondrial DNA haplotypes that were identified from skin samples of humpback whales. And the main thing that it shows you is that there are a few haplotypes like this one shown. I think that's a yellow color, right? Yellow or orange. And you'll see that it's very prevalent off California, but when you get up here in Washington, it starts to decrease and is almost gone by the time you get up here to British Columbia. And that's a haplotype pattern that is very characteristic of humpback whales from Central America. And it's actually a pattern that looks a little bit like Antarctic southern hemisphere humpback whales, and so it may have been one that transferred from the southern hemisphere to the northern hemisphere. And then you see other haplotype patterns that as you go north up the latitude become more prevalent, like this haplotype here is very low, rises, and becomes one of the dominant types, and it's a type of haplotype that's very common in Hawaii, but you'll see it's almost absent from the U.S. West Coast, and it's just starting to become more prevalent here off Washington, which is where this is here. So I think this kind of paints, what I'm hoping to do is now that we have this reverse order with Fred going after me, you'll sort of see that this area here of the Salish Sea in Washington State represents sort of an interesting transition area between the humpbacks that Fred studies heavily in BC and Southeast Alaska and where my main research has been off California. So now let's look at just these recent sightings and where they've been occurring. So now this is an updated map of sightings, and this is drawing, as Susan mentioned, we've relied heavily on the sightings that come into Orca Network. In the last year, we've actually gone through, and with Susan and Howie's help, we've taken all the locations people report humpback whale sightings, we've turned those into lat longs. We've tried to reconcile them with sightings that go into the Whale Museum and have come into Cascadia research, and created a good database that we can now plot. And so all of these show sightings now of humpback whales, not just concentrated up here where a lot of the whale watch activity is, but spreading all the way through Puget Sound and the Salish Sea. And that's been this very exciting development of what's changed. This map would look nothing like this if we were using the data up to 3 years ago. It's really filled in heavily, and we've actually updated this through 2015, so this is really including some of these very recent sightings. So you can just see how prevalent these animals are, and I think this is still probably underrepresenting, the true occurrence. Now, why have the humpback whales increased in this area? And one context for that is that we've seen overall that off California and Oregon and through the SPLASH study in the North Pacific as a whole, humpback whales have been recovering. This is our data from the U.S. West Coast going back to some of our earlier research. Gretchen and I got involved with starting humpback whale research off California in the mid-'80s, and one of the key starting the starting team was Gretchen, Jim Cubbage, myself, and a researcher we were teaming up with for the first time, Ken Balcom. And Ken had been studying humpback whales in the East Coast and other areas, and so he's kind of the one who helped us in getting started with humpback whale work in the mid-1980s off California. And through that, we've been continuing that work and been able to track the humpback whale changes in abundance off the U.S. West Coast. So you can see that from the early 1990s, because it was only about 1991 that we started surveying all of the U.S. West Coast enough to get an estimate using mark recapture and photo ID, we've seen a pretty steady increase in humpback whale numbers. And I won't belabor you, these are 3 different lines based on 3 different mathematical models that you can use to estimate abundance from the recapture rate of the same individuals that you recite and identify with these individual ID photos. We are seeing a little bit of evidence in recent years of this maybe leveling off, but up to recent years this has been increasing at about 7% per year, a very healthy rate of increase. Really matches, humpback whales were hunted throughout the 1900s, and there were whaling stations that even operated out of areas like San Francisco Bay through 1966. So really the hunting of humpback whales has only occurred in our generation. Some of the humpback whales that are alive today were hunted in those. So, and I'm going to jump over a couple of these here just to, maybe I'll jump over them if it'll let me. These are just estimates of humpback whale abundance for the North Pacific, trends in the North Pacific. But let's go to this figure. This is brand new data, now just taking the data from Washington and southern British Columbia, and how has that population changed using these same models of abundance. And you'll see from the mid-1990s we had a bunch of work, and it really showed this kind of Washington, southern BC humpback whale only numbered about 100 or 200 animals, though there was some indication that was increasing. Now, with some of the recent data we've been getting, we have some estimates from 2011 and 2013, and you'll see our estimates are up here, almost approaching 1,000 animals. And again, this curve here shows an increase rate that's right along that about 7% per year rate. So we have seen this dramatic increase, and this is the overall humpback whale population using Washington, southern BC, not just the animals coming into the Salish Sea. So we think part of what's occurred with the increased sightings inside the Salish Sea and in Puget Sound is really this overall feeding area that primarily is consisted of areas off the Washington coast has increased, and the animals are expanding back into some of their former range. Now, what does it look like if we look at these sightings that have come into, again, Orca Network, Cascadia, and Whale Museum? How has that changed over time? Now, this is taking just the sightings coming in that represent the Salish Sea. And here it is now, again, for the mid-1990s through 2015. And you can just see that dramatic increase, particularly for 2014 and 2015, the right two bars. And that's at a rate that's way beyond 7%. So I think what we've really seen here hasn't so much been, an internal increase. It's really represented this larger population expanding into the Salish Sea. So the rate of that increase has been way above that 7% per year. That's an even more dramatic increase. But this shows you how things have changed here. Unlike our abundance estimates, this unfortunately is not controlled for effort. It's not based on a mathematical mark recapture. So this is a little bit biased by, as people report humpback whales more, that could partly reflect the reporting factor as well as the number of humpback whales. And some of what's occurred is we've seen that as humpback whales have become more common, more and more of whale watching activity tends to focus on humpback whales as well, as they become a more reliable species that you can go out and find. I was going to mention just a little bit about whaling. We've had a lot of hunting for humpback whales that occurred off the Washington coast. This is a photo taken from Grays Harbor off the Washington coast. It was a major whaling area in the early 1900s for humpback whales. There's even some interesting history that pertains specifically to the Salish Sea. There was a whaling station that started up at what they called Page's Lagoon at that point off southern Vancouver Island. And it actually was a whaling station that operated in winter months, specifically targeting animals in the Salish Sea in the early 1900s. And Andrew Treitz, in a recent book he did on a chapter in one of the books on the Salish Sea ecosystem, talks about he unearthed a letter by, it was a captain that operated tour boats that operated off southern Vancouver Island, and they included in these tours whale watching. And he was actually writing, trying to prevent this whaling effort from occurring that ended up wiping out the humpback whales that were wintering in the Salish Sea. And so, it was just a kind of a shock to both Gretchen and I to read this and realize that some of those debates were occurring in that time frame. We're used to thinking, no one was thinking whale watching in the early 1900s, but actually it was even occurring then. I wanted to briefly show you just some of the results of where these animals breed that we have in the Salish Sea. So this is just a simple table on the right that says coastal. That's the data we had from those outer coast areas of Washington, and it showed that mixture with the main area we matched humpback whales in terms of a breeding area was mainland Mexico. Second most common was Hawaii. And then we had Baja California, but also those offshore ray vaqueros and a few animals to Central America, showing just that diversity of breeding areas that these animals come from. And now that right column is the one we're trying to, the column on the left that says inland is the one we're trying to slowly build up for these Salish Sea animals. And you'll see, even though the sample size is smaller, right now the proportions are somewhat similar. The main area is mainland Mexico that we've matched in terms of a breeding area. Second most is Hawaii, and third most is the Ray Valleros, the offshore islands of Mexico. So that's that's what we hope to build up quite a bit more of, but right now that proportion is kind of matching up. And it is also kind of confirming what we've been seeing, is that these animals in the Salish Sea are these animals from the outer coast that have spread in and are showing some of the same patterns and behavior. And that's becoming more important now because there's a proposal by NOAA to downlist or delist humpback whales. And interestingly, it also recognizes different distinct population segments of humpback whales based on their breeding areas. And some, like Central America or the western North Pacific, would remain threatened, whereas other areas like Hawaii or mainland Mexico would be delisted. And that's going to actually make it even more important to understand where some of these humpback whales breed, because their status under the Endangered Species Act will now become more directly linked to those breeding areas. Okay. How am I doing on time? I'm probably about, yeah. Let me, I was going to just mention we've been doing more and more tag deployments of humpback whales to look at what they're doing underwater and how they're feeding. I'll skip over those slides and maybe I'll just show you just a few seconds of this slide and not the whole thing, which is this is deploying one of these suction cup video tags just last October on a humpback whale in Monterey Bay. And that's an area that we've become very concerned as these humpback whales have recovered. We're also becoming more aware of their competition with commercial fishing. So this is actually a video we prepared and put online partly to lobby the North Pacific Fishery Management Council to add more protections to anchovy because it was an area they weren't really considering some of the importance they played for not just human fishing, but also for the whales. So we just deployed this tag on a humpback whale here. Now you'll see the two images that we get. On the right side is looking backwards along the whale, and on the left side we'll be looking forward along the whale. And so you see the fluke moving, that's its dorsal fin. You'll see these sea lions coming in and out of view that are picking off. There are about 7 or 8 whales here, so you'll see other whales come into view. And I'll just take it through the first feeding lunge and then stop. So what it turns out is as these humpbacks, so that's a school of anchovies you see on the top left there. And this whale's going to go into it. That's the anchovy school. And that's it going in and lunging. You can see some of the individual anchovies. It's broken up this school. And then the birds and the sea lions can actually start picking off these anchovies. That's another whale it almost collides with. And for example, tonight I'm hoping to spend a little time with Fred looking at this because one of the things that surprised me in looking at this video is it reveals some of the ways these humpback whales are cooperatively feeding with sea lions and some of the birds, but some of the images also suggest a fair amount of competition between some of the individual humpbacks. And I'm just curious to compare that to the cooperative feeding he's documenting. Okay, I'm going to try to move on from this slide to see if we can stop it. But we got we got 6 hours of that footage, and that literally is the first minute we just saw there. It doesn't all stay that good, but there's a good hour of that stuff. So just to bring up our main conclusions, clearly the return of humpback whales to the inside waters of Washington and southern BC, is pretty clearly documented, and it's really these animals returning to an area they used prior to the early 1900s that was largely wiped out by whaling that occurred. And it's neat to see not only have there been increased numbers, but now we're seeing these much more winter and late season animals that match what occurred prior to those whaling days. Our evidence so far is that's really an extension of that Washington outer coast, southern BC feeding area we had documented in our earlier research, and animals really pushing in from that to inside waters, likely as a result of that overall population recovery that we're seeing for humpback whales throughout the North Pacific. And we've seen that humpback whales from this region kind of follow migrations that are pretty diverse. They go to numerous of these breeding areas, kind of matching what we had documented for the Washington, southern BC animals. Some of the last areas that we're really looking to work with right now, we're collaborating with Center for Whale Research and Mark Mallison and a number of other people that are contributing photo IDs from humpback whales from the Salish Sea and dramatically expanding that photo ID, both the catalog but also the matches that with the use of Splash and these other historical catalogs, we can much more precisely look at where these animals we're seeing in Salish Sea have previously been documented feeding and what are their breeding areas. So we're excited to do that, and that's making big leaps forward. We're adding dramatically to that just this year. Understanding that breeding status as it links to those new ESA designations has been important. And then I think particularly trying to document this increased winter use and what these animals are doing here. We had a stranding just a few weeks ago of a juvenile humpback whale, a sighting yesterday down off Nisqually in the same area, trying to see if some of these animals are able to feed, what they're feeding on, and making sure the type of prey that they're targeting is protected and available for them now that they're returning to these waters. And again, I really want to thank, a lot of this work wouldn't be possible without the major contributions of people like Mark, the sightings that come in to people from the Orca Network, into Orca Network and into Whale Museum and other groups like that. So thanks a lot.
So John will take a few questions while we're switching computers. But I also want to mention that our Welcome the Whales Day is April 16th, and John has agreed to come up and do some North Puget Sound gray whale, a presentation with some of the cool video that they got with suction cup tags on our gray whales last year. So thank you again, and let's take some questions.
Okay, any questions right here? Yeah. Yeah. And I think generally you're correct. What she was saying is that as a naturalist, she tells people feed like crazy when they're on the humpbacks feed like crazy when they're on the feeding grounds, and then they migrate and go to breeding areas and they don't feed for this extended period. And that still is the general pattern. We're just learning humpback whales, do a lot of things in a more varied way than that. And certainly there are age classes of animals, and I think this has been documented up in southeast Alaska and many other areas, that animals stay very, very late in the season, sometimes don't migrate at all. They continue feeding off California and off the U.S. East Coast. The same thing's been documented, especially with juvenile animals staying through the winter and feeding. There's some new data just presented at the Marine Mammal Conference in December that was analyzing the migration dives of humpback whales and was speculating, based on the types of dives those animals were doing, that they were actually exploratory dives, and the animals would sometimes linger at certain areas that they suspect they might still be looking for food even on migration. So I think while that, what you described is true as a general rule, we just see lots of little flavors and variations on that. And it makes sense, that these animals would be looking for opportunities to keep feeding where they could find it. But it's going to be nowhere near as productive and as important as that key feeding in the summer that you were describing.
Okay, I think we're going to have to move on. Unfortunately, and maybe you'll be around, so during the break we can give more questions to John. And actually, which one would you rather? You probably are going to dance around. Thanks to John for being flexible here. And